There has been much talk in the last few years about the growth of precarious work, work defined as poorly paid, insecure, unprotected work which cannot support a household. You'd think that such work would be the lot of people with poor education, and yet this type of work exists among those with PhDs. They are called adjunct, sessional, contingent, or contract faculty, and they teach students who aspire to obtain degrees in order to avoid finding themselves working in precarious jobs. So, to help us understand the nature of what it means and what it feels like being a non-tenured faculty, we welcome Moira McDonald. She's a freelance writer and sometimes sessional faculty. Marie Vanderkloot, educational consultant and sometimes sessional faculty. And Bob Hunka, contract faculty in the Departments of Communication Studies and Humanities at York University. And it's good to have you three around the table. I want to welcome you, and in doing so, read a little something of what Ken Coates just said in the interview prior to us. Here he is from the University of Saskatchewan, in which he said, the use of adjuncts, meaning all of you, is dictated by our business model. The only way universities in Ontario can afford to pay high professor salaries and to create the research opportunities is to flood the first and second year classes with sessional instructors. The reality is that you have real trouble managing the university if half of your teachers are not part of the collegial process. They're not there to advise the students. They're not there over 4 years to help the students go through. Okay, let's get Moira to you first here. Ken Coates says half the profs, half of them, are non-tenured sessional instructors. Is it really that high in your experience?
Well, in my experience is dual, because I have worked as a sessional instructor, but I also have written about the issue of sessional instructors. And in fact, the problem is, and I'm sure we'll get into this more, there isn't really data on how many sessional instructors there are, what proportion of classes they're teaching.
So we don't know.
We don't know for sure, but the estimates that I've come across will point to about 20 to 30% of your faculty are sessionals, but they're teaching far more courses than that. The proportion may be anywhere between 50%. I've heard as high as 90% in some cases.
Why are they teaching a disproportionate part of the classing?
Because there's a demand there for the teaching, and they're cheap. We're putting more students into university. There's definitely a push on to have students going through post-secondary. So we've got demand for classes, and we've got an issue with costs at the administrative level. So sessionals are very convenient that way. And we have a reduction of tenure track positions at the faculty level.
What's it like being one?
Well, I have to say for myself, I've taught in a night school capacity as a sessional, so it's quite different. I'm one of those people who teaches as part of a mix of different kinds of work that I do. So I never set out to become a professor or anything like that, although sometimes my students call me that. But I'm a journalist primarily, and I teach on the side, and I really enjoy it. But for those who have to do it, or it's their full-time gig, it's a really hard road.
Marie, how does it work for you when you are a sessional lecturer?
I think it works quite differently for me now than it did a few years ago. So now I have a permanent role at McMaster where I can rely on stable income, and I don't have to continuously, apply for my job over and over and over again the way many sessional instructors have to. But a few years ago, when I was primarily sessionally teaching for my income, it was, a deeply frustrating and anxiety-inducing experience.
Why? What particular?
There's no stability. There's no sense of when it might end, for example, or if it will end.
So they don't hire you for a whole year?
No, well, most sessionals get hired per course, right? So you're hired for a semester, and sometimes all of the hiring may happen, in the summer period for the full year, but there's also postings that come up at all given times, right? If people drop courses or if they add, something in the next semester. So there's very little stability or sense of being able to, organize one's own time.
When you're actually in the thick of it,
yeah.
do you, and you see those professors with tenure,
right,
who are as Moira suggests, perhaps teaching a disproportionately smaller amount than you are.
Right.
Do you feel a bit like a second-class citizen in that milieu?
I would say I think that characterizes a lot of sessional work. I had some good experiences as a sessional where I taught in departments where they made an exceptional effort to try and include sessionals, which I think is atypical, and I would certainly characterize it that way, where those would be departments where they would invite sessionals to come to departmental meetings, where I was given an office, where I had some of those things that are not always available. So in those circumstances, I think people were trying to bridge the gap that exists between full-time and part-time instructors. But I think that that's an exceptional experience that I have had. And some of my other courses were not so rosy.
Not so rosy. What's your experience doing this?
Well, very similar to echo Marie. It's the experience of being a contingent faculty member is the experience of precariousness, and with that comes a whole bundle of feelings from frustration to, I would say, fear. Fear that you may lose your work because the time horizons for all these various contracts, per course contracts, fixed term contracts of various kinds, are usually no more than a year. Sometimes you're lucky if you get to have a 2 or 3 year contract, which is what I'm on now.
If the fear is there, does that mean that if you see something that concerns you, you're more than likely going to shut up about it?
I'm glad you raised this because I think one of the threats that precariousness poses is to academic freedom. And so I see this as part and parcel of this threat that precariousness poses for faculty who are not on tenure track positions, and it has a chilling effect, right? You're less likely to be vocal or raise concerns with your department chair or your deans if your department chairs are not playing by the rules of the collective agreements, because we're talking about unionized environments here.
Are you in the union?
And I'm in, yes, the contract faculty is part of the QP Local 3903, which represents contract faculty, but also students.
So wait a sec, you're in a CUPE union, you're not in the sort of faculty association union.
We should clarify that part of the gap or division here is partly institutionalized, and at certain universities there may be 2 unions. In the case of York, yes, there's one union for the tenure and tenures stream faculty, the York University Faculty Association, and there's another union to which contract faculty belong, but they're grouped in with students who are also teaching assistants and research assistants.
So the tenured profs are in the cool union, and you guys are in the sort of the go over there and stand in the corner union.
They're in the tier 1, the top tier,
Got it.
and we're in the bottom tier of the 2-tier faculty employment system.
Let me put that Ken Quotes comment to you again. The only way universities in Ontario can afford to pay high professor salaries is to flood the first and second year classes with sessional instructors. Does that suggest there is a bit of a class war in our universities between the tenured track, A1 profs, and the rest of you?
I wouldn't say there's a war because it's not experienced as a war in people's lived experience of the academy, and there are a range of those experiences, but that divide is what produces the inequity among those 2 classes or ranks of faculty. So I would say, yes, the classroom is the site of a 2-tier, 2-class faculty employment system conflict, and actually should be brought out more to raise the awareness of this divide, because all of the equity issues that we're going to talk about here, I think, which are topped up by institutionalized racism, ageism, ableism, sexism. That's on top of this 2-tier divide and the inequity that produces.
Okay, hang on. You've just made the university campus sound like a cauldron of every awful ism there is in society. Did you really mean to say that?
I did. Unfortunately, my colleagues who are better placed and positioned within the academic world are bringing these issues to the fore in the discussions I'm part of as part of the contract faculty, and we have a listserv. And it's not me, but it's other members that I guess I'm speaking on behalf of, who feel that that is on top of the issue of precarity. It's not surprising because precarious conditions also are running parallel to work in the rest of the labor market. In fact, a study done by McMaster University a couple of years ago showed that precarious labor in Ontario has a direct effect on households in terms of causing stress. So we have experiences of precarity that we share with the rest of the workforce, but there are unique aspects or features of precarious academic work.
Moira, pick up on that if you will. How many different places have you taught at, incidentally, as a sessional lecturer?
I've taught at 2 different institutions. I've taught in community college, and I've taught at Ryerson University in the Chang School, so continuing education, night school.
So a pretty decent base of different experiences.
Yes.
Yeah. Is the cauldron of awfulness that I'm hearing from Bob present in your everyday existence at these places?
Well, I've taught 1 semester with Ryerson and 1 semester with Centennial College, so I certainly don't have the depth of experience that he has. But I would say that I've also taught as a lab instructor in the day school, the regular day school at Ryerson University. And it's not that people are unfriendly, it's just that the people who are working as teaching assistants and working as sessionals, we're coming and going. And we may be there 1 semester and not there the next. We're just not part of that regular full-time culture. And so it's just, I think part of it is human nature. I think there's also some work being done to try to bridge that there is some recognition that is going on and it is affecting the intellectual life of the institution. But it happens, and certainly when you're working as a continuing education instructor, you're coming in at night. So you're lucky if you even see a few other instructors before you go into your classroom and close the door. And really, you're there for your students, but it sure would be nice if you had that camaraderie of mixing with other people who are teaching as well, and it makes a difference to your job.
Well, that's the thing we need to pick up on. Marie, I mean, at the end of the day, I suppose what is really important is not just the experiences that all of you are bringing to the table here, but how this has an impact on the students that you are educating. Does it have an impact on the students you are educating?
I would say absolutely.
How so?
I think so. In the quote from Ken Coates that you read out at the start, he comments on, what is the impact of students over a period of time. And I think one of the effects of having a disproportionate number of sessional faculty as instructors is that a lot of students are relying on faculty to be able to do things like write reference letters for them, to be a point of contact for their own development as scholars in a particular field. And with sessional instructors, they may not know if they're going to be there, next year. So for example, should I work on this thesis project? Should I pursue this co-op option? That person may not be around in the future for further discussion of it. And also because we know that there is a bit of a sort of a tiering in terms of power between sessionals and permanent faculty. I know as a sessional, when students have come to me to say, could you write a reference letter for me for law school, this scholarship, this,
whatever.
My response to them is always, is there someone who's a permanent faculty member who you could ask? Because their reference letter will be weighted differently than mine would be weighted. And I think what happens to students when there are very few people in their faculty who are still permanent faculty, what are the supports that exist for students, and how well can a program really grow and develop when people don't have the time to really commit to building a strong program for students?
You are almost describing a caste system here. Does it feel that way?
I would say yes, but I also want to go back to, I think, what Bob was saying, to say that it's not just about a sort of a hierarchy that exists between sessionals and permanent faculty, but that there are other sort of power relations that also factor into that particular dynamic. So I do think paying attention to things like race or sex or ability, that those things also factor into how this dynamic works. So it's not just a tiering between these two groups, but that there are, broader power relations that impact who teaches what and in what way at the university.
And Bob, again, on the issue of the students themselves, do they notice the difference between a class that is taught by a full-time tenured professor and a class that is taught by a sessional lecturer who may be here today, but 3 months from now may be on to another gig?
In their everyday classroom experience, whether they have a tenured or non-tenured track faculty member in front of them, there are as many competent or good or excellent tenured as there are competent or good or excellent or maybe incompetent contract faculty, right? So that's not, in terms of their perceptual awareness, they may be completely unaware of the status and the relationship that faculty member has to their employer. Because what's invisible is that relationship to the employer and the contracts that are on.
But that's what I'm wondering. When a student picks a class, is part of the judgment that goes into whether they pick the class, I know I'm going to get a tenured, full-time, 25-year veteran professor for this class, whereas I know I'm only going to get a one-year sessional lecturer who may be gone the following year in that class. And is that part of the decision-making process?
For some savvy students, that may be part of their calculus, but I think a larger majority of students, frankly, even for my courses, pick the course because of the day and time that it's offered.
As opposed to your brilliance being a major factor.
I'm afraid to say.
How disappointing,
so,
eh?
Yes.
How disappointing.
So, but in terms of, I would agree with Marie's point that it starts to affect the academic integrity of programs themselves when you have a large proportion of contingent faculty. And it's not just in terms of the culture of the department and how inclusive or exclusive it might be, but the actual governance. And governance begins at the department level, and so we're participating less in that governance. So we're not also involved in the discussions that take place around academic planning, and we're missing. Our voices are missing from that. So
why can't you be part of the cool union as opposed to the not so cool union? I mean, is that an option for you guys?
Yes. Well, York may be a bit above the standard of the sector because we actually have a provision in our collective agreement for something called conversion, and it's an affirmative action program that will move some qualified contract faculty, long service qualified faculty from off the tenure track to a tenure track appointment. But that's, I'd say, the exception to the pattern of collective agreements, and other universities and unions look towards York as kind of having a standard there to aspire to.
But you still maintain that there's two unions, and my research generally that can be the case, although there are some cases where the contract faculty are represented within the faculty association, and there's debates that continue to go on as to what's ideal. Should they be represented by a faculty association whose members are well, it's a faculty association, so you've got your tenured people, and their interests may be quite different, and they may, in some cases, feel threatened by sessional instructors or faculty members. And so, are you mixing those two interests up together, or do you have greater strength if you're able to find common ground and see that this issue affecting the sessionals, in fact, is everybody's issue?
Gotcha. Marie, either one of the best things or one of the worst things that was ever invented for the post-secondary sector are these websites which are, ratemyprofessor.com, these kinds of things. And, and I want to try to understand the impact these kinds of sites have. If you've got tenure and you've been there 25 years and somebody goes to ratemyprofessor.com and gives you a lousy review, okay, you're not happy about it, but your job's not over tomorrow, right? Does it add to the precarious nature of how you do your job and how you feel about your job if you get a bad review on one of those kind of websites?
I think those websites and I may be off base here, but I think most faculty sessional or permanent tend to treat them as the joke that they are somewhat intended to be.
Do the students treat them that way?
I think a lot of students are quite reluctant to see them as actually providing any actual real information, in contrast to something like the U of T's anti-calendar, which is actually something students may consult in terms of selecting courses. So I think something like Rate My Professor, you know, it's intended to be a bit comedic, you know, like how important is it that your faculty member that you're picking their class is hot? It's not that important compared to time and day. But I do think that the evaluations of teaching that happen at the university, that those have considerable bearing, and those warrant a bit of attention, because those can have real consequence for sessional faculty when they reapply for positions, because those are taken seriously within the institution. And they, you know, they may get a slightly more representative sample of the number of students who complete them compared to Rate My Professor, you know, which you don't even need to be sure that you're actually in the class in order to complete any information there. And in contrast to the sessional reviews that will happen at the end of every semester, those I think are much more serious than Rate My Professor.
Did you want a word on that, Bob?
Just the Rate My Prof is a sideshow and an amusing after dinner conversation thing. But
did you ever get a bad review on one?
Probably, sure, yeah, because it's the ideal place for a student who's dissatisfied, who's underperformed, who hasn't met the instructor halfway, which is part of the social contract between professors and students, who were looking for an easy credit, and they found rigor and they didn't like it, and so they'll just vent.
Off.
Sure.
Gotcha. Here's also from Ken Coates. We've created this situation that made this possible by a massive overproduction of people with PhDs. And I want to know if that's right. Low salaries for contract faculty because there are just too many PhDs out there who are willing, well, I guess, you got to go where the work is, and they're willing to contend with inferior circumstances because they want to teach. Moira, do you find that?
Well, from, again, going back to my research as a journalist on this sort of thing, I certainly talked to a lot of disheartened PhDs who put all this work into a degree and only to come out the other side and find that they're stuck in this low-paying, undervalued position. And I do see that with the push on for more credentialing, generally, it's not just you need your BA or a BSc. You need a master's, you need a PhD. And so to me, as a journalist, my question is, well, to what end? I mean, and really, what is the purpose? There are people who will pursue a PhD because they just love the subject and they want to take it as far as they can go. And there are others who do it under the belief that there's going to be something at the end of the rainbow for them, and there isn't. And I think that this problem is influenced certainly by the fact that there are still, it's not like there's no supply of people to do this work, but they have a common complaint.
That is the sense, isn't it, Marie, that if you have a great desire to teach in the post-secondary sector, the conventional wisdom is you've got to have a PhD if you want to go anywhere, right? That's there, isn't it?
Yes.
And therefore, there are a lot of people under the assumption that if they get their PhD, they're in business, but they're not. Is that right?
Well, I mean, we don't want to assume that everyone who begins a PhD is completely naive about what the labor market looks like, because I think a lot of people are starting to be much more attuned to what are the prospects that exist. I also think that, you can't necessarily foresee what is the future. I know when I started my doctorate, there was a lot of discussion about that there was intended to be a wave of retirement, but then they changed the age of mandatory retirement. So that had a big impact on how long people might stay in their faculty roles. As well, we're seeing, by and large, that faculty retire and they don't get replaced. So, we're seeing a huge shrink in the number of permanent positions. So even if people, planned effectively and looked at what was out there and gave a lot of consideration to what their future might look like in terms of teaching at the university, all of those things may change in the time it takes to complete a doctorate, since it doesn't happen over, a semester.
Bob, but if there's one thing I know about unions, they want more members. So why wouldn't the faculty association, like the cool unions, the A1 unions, why wouldn't they want to represent people who do what you do, given that if you get a job and you're part of their union, you're paying dues to that union, they get to represent you, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, in some ways there's enormous common ground around the issue of precarious labor, and there are progressive-minded members of all unions who can see that common ground. Why that doesn't happen, that's for geohistorically specific reasons peculiar to each institution, but certainly there's been calls for faculty to cooperate, right?
But have you ever gone to the York faculty and say, why don't you guys want to represent us? We want to be represented by you. Why don't you want to represent us?
Because the answer is not so simple, because it has to do with legal relationships between the union and their employer, and but you're right. I think behind your point is a good point, having to do with this two-tier system, which is institutionalized for all the reasons that were given. Is partly institutionalized by unions if there are two unions in the same university. Mm-hmm. So for me, actually, I've called, and others have called for, more autonomy for contract faculty and more solidarity between unions if there are different unions.
Well, let me try this. A few minutes to go here, and it seems pretty obvious that the world is not going to change in a way that would allow more sessional lecturers to become full-time tenured faculty. Mm-hmm. So some might ask the question, why don't we go in the other direction and have no more tenure, mm-hmm. and have more people be more like you as opposed to the opposite, which is not going to happen? Is that an option?
Well, sessional lecturers, sessional faculty, their jobs are somewhat different than full-time faculty. And this is one of the arguments that's made on the administrative side as to why they're paid differently, because the full-time tenured faculty also have service components, so that's sitting on committees, that sort of thing, and then they have the research component. And plenty of sessional faculty would love to be paid for time to research, no question about that. And they might even have some interest in doing some of the committee work so that they have input into curriculum and governance and all those sorts of things. But that's not the case right now. So there are differences, and that's sort of the argument that gets made as to why there is a difference. But then you get into things like, should we have teaching only faculty? And then the question becomes, well, what would that look like? And then how do you pay that? And that sort of thing.
It's complicated.
Yes.
Bob, you want to get rid of tenure?
I wanted to add, do I want to get rid of tenure?
Yeah.
Absolutely not. I've been aspiring to a tenured position since I earned my PhD in 1987. And now I put in 14 years at York, and that doesn't feel like part-time. So that for us to still even refer to that as part-time employment seems a bit much.
Are you any closer to a tenured position?
Every year I take a shot at openings, but I want to just pick up on the point about the model that you have with the PhD, and if you're planning to go in the academic world, right. That is an historical model of academic work which bundles together teaching and research. And one of the other side effects of precarious work, and this was something you were referring to, which is the unbundling of teaching and research. Mm-hmm. And we're talking about public universities who have research missions and often are saying we should intensify research. But they're really, with these kinds of contracts, unbundling work that historically has been bundled together. And the last thing I would say about that is that at the bottom of this is not just of this gap, this divide is not just income differences, not just differences in access to things like resources and also funding for research, huge differences there, but differences in autonomy. And this is what you're talking about now, the autonomy that comes from participating as a full and equal departmental citizen.
I got to say, the last 30 seconds for you. You want to get rid of tenure and make the playing field even in that way?
I don't think so, and that doesn't even the playing field. I think that's a good example of a sort of race to the bottom type of argument to try and resolve a problem that exists in the university sector. I think tenure remains really important. It remains important to the intellectual life of the university, and I think many people like Bob and myself might be people who continue to look at what are the tenure options that exist out there, and I think many people in the sessional track are hopeful.
You still aspire to it?
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
I think one of the things right now that's important to attend to is that tenured positions have also degraded over time. That they are also becoming much more labor intensive. They're not the promised land they sort of maybe appear to be.
Gotcha. Boy, it's a complicated world out there. Okay, thanks to the three of you for coming in and helping us out with this tonight. Moira McDonald, the freelance writer and sometimes sessional faculty. Marie Vanderkloot, educational consultant, also looking for sessional positions. And Bob Hunka, contract faculty at York University. Good to have all three of you at TVO tonight.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.